All right, good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to ACM. I'm Nora. I'm the Deputy Director and Principal Curator at ACM, and I have the utmost pleasure of being your MC and moderator this evening. So I would like to warmly welcome you again, this time to ACM Conversations, our monthly series that brings together distinguished scholars, cultural practitioners, artisans and community leaders from Singapore and around the world for engaging dialogues with our curators and educators. So this evening, we are extremely honored and privileged to welcome Professor Mathew Trinca to ACM. Professor Trinca was formerly Director of the National Museum of Australia from 2014 to 2024 and is currently Professor of Museum Practice at the Australian National University. He also serves as the chair of the board of Canberra's Cultural Facilities Corporation, Commissioner for Culture and Olympic Heritage, advising the International Olympic Committee, and we're also really pleased to have him as a board member of the Asian Civilisations Museum. In 2020, he was made a member of the Order of Australia for services to the museums and gallery sector. Now, tonight probably promises to be a really enriching presentation, and so without further ado, can I invite Professor Trinca to the stage?
Thanks, Nora. I was saying to Clement that I was a little shocked earlier on today when I was looking at a photo of myself and not recognising myself, and then up flashes that photograph before, where I don't know, I think it's is that 20 years ago? Anyway, I wouldn't blame you if you think this is a different human being standing before you now. It's a great pleasure to be here with you tonight. It's always a great pleasure to be in Singapore. Some of you I know, others I hope we get a chance to say a few words after together my presentation. But I cannot just say this, every time I'm in Singapore I'm so struck by the warmth of the welcome, and I must thank the director and all the staff here for the warmth of the welcome I've enjoyed on this occasion, and also just the sheer delight I have of being involved in the life of this institution, this great institution, the Asian Civilisations Museum. I'm going to talk about something that, curiously, as you see as I go on tonight, I actually think I in part learnt from you around practice here in Singapore, and then it in a way stimulated my thinking about the place of museums in our society. And I hope that becomes clearer as I go on and we can have a conversation about how we take these ideas further into the future. Last year, the Australian government, I'm going to talk about Australia because clearly that's a fair bit of the background that I have in the museum business, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about Singapore. Last year, the Australian government invested more than $500 million in funding 10 national cultural institutions, all but one of which are in Canberra, the other one's in Sydney. And they range from my old museum, I don't know if I can say mine in such a possessive way, but the one which I led for some years, the National Museum of Australia, the National Gallery of Australia, to the Australian War Memorial, which some of you would know, through to the Museum of Australian Democracy, which is actually at the early Parliament House that was built in Canberra in 1927, so it celebrates 100 years next year, and the National Portrait Gallery and others. That's a massive investment in the cultural life of nation. And the Federal Office of the Arts, that really is a responsible portfolio for these institutions, describes the role of these organisations like this. Australia's collecting institutions protect and celebrate Australia's rich cultural heritage, share resources, mentor regional partners, provide advice to government, and sector on best practice for collecting cultural material. Now, that's a pretty traditional rendition, you would say, of what museums do. What does the government get for that investment? Well, in 2023-24, financial year that runs from July to June in Australia, there were 7.3 million visits to those institutions, 3.5 million off-site 3.7 million on-site. When they say off-site, they mean to exhibitions that are touring from those institutions around the country or perhaps overseas. I love the little note. The numbers may not add up due to rounding or just because we got the maths wrong. And the access in terms of website sessions, these are not page views, which is a higher figure, but the total sort of website sessions were getting on towards 40 million, and you can see those figures there. Now, actually, those sort of combined figures about, in the crudest sense, the sense of participation of the Australian community in the life of those institutions are lower than they were pre-COVID. And I think that's probably the case here. We're still in the process of recovering from those COVID years. To give you some idea, in 2019, there were actually 11.6 million visits. So that's considerably more than, was it 7.3? 7.3 million visits. Now, so you can see that's we've still another 50% really to go just to make it back to 1920 levels. And there was about close to 50 million visits online in terms of those that access. This was the reason, COVID, as it was here. And as I understand it, that recovery is happening now in Singapore, and we're expecting audiences to track back. Certainly, we're fortunate in the sense that around the world we know COVID led to the closure of some museums. And we certainly came close with a few in Australia, but ultimately, because we're largely government-funded organisations, as here, we survived what were very straightening times. We're coming out of it, but to my mind, myriad challenges remain. The emergence of AI, new technologies, growth in the range of entertainment and informational experiences, and let's face it, the diminishing attention spans of people in what is a very overloaded social media and web environment means that museums are going to need, if they want to continue to thrive and nourish their societies, they're going to need to be prepared for change. I can't see any other way through it. Don't get me wrong, I think we have done amazing things in recent decades by marrying the traditional strengths we had in making and exhibiting collections together with that wholehearted focus we now have on visitors. If you think about that being one of the great turns that we've made in the last 30 years, we now unimpeachably are focused on our visitors and our audiences, our publics, but we have this great strength that distinguishes us, in my opinion, and that is the collections that we hold. I'm not such a radical that I think we should, in saying that we need to change, that we want to throw those things out the window. I hope that makes you happy. It makes me happy to think about collections remaining at the very centre of museums and our publics. But, and there's a part of me thinks, oh, have I? Oh, the wrong one. There we are, the museum closed. Very sad-looking museum where you don't see cars in the car park in Australia. It's a little different here, but that's a great sign that something is wrong when you see a place look like that. But it's these things, great, compelling collections, that really are at the centre of so much of what we do. And these collections, I believe, will remain the distinguishing characteristic of what museums do, for all that I'm about to say about the prospect of change. And there's just a few examples. The first one, the Papunya Tula collection of First Nations art from Central Australia, and this one, a beautiful piece of silverware made in Australia in the 19th century. We love museums and other cultural institutions because they're really us. They hold the memory of nations, in my opinion, not just artefacts, as in the museums that we're talking about. So this great museum, the museum that I formerly ran, but also all those other institutions that hold books, manuscripts, photographs, audiovisual recordings, archives. These are the material traces of who we are. And We have learnt, as I said before, over the same time, those 3 decades or so that I mentioned. I need to go back. Oh, that's right, there we go. We have learnt that it's people that are at the centre of all we do. There's another, for those of you who can strain your eyes, another young photo of your speaker, but with, importantly, a room full of people in the lobby of the Great Hall of the National Museum. And this turn to the visitor, as Stephen Weil said 2 decades ago, has transformed our business, and I think in a very welcome way. And you already saw that quote that I've got there from Nina Simon, very sort of influential book when it was published, The Participatory Museum, talking about the way that we wanted to bring, and we've worked to bring people into the life of these institutions and give them an opportunity to participate alongside us. Many of us here tonight are lucky enough to work in these places. And really, so often I feel what we're trying to do is actually bring publics in and let them stand in our shoes for a little while. Let them feel the sheer joy and excitement we feel at working in these places and having this relationship to the things, these traces of our past. I reckon, as a manifesto for the Contemporary Museum, I like to think it's broadly accepted that we're trying to do this. We're trying to do these things. We're trying to involve publics, people in the life of our institutions. Not all of it necessarily in the same way, but broadly speaking, we're trying to involve people in what we do. Now, while COVID, as I've already said, dealt a blow to our visitor numbers and an unexpected dividend rather of that was that it also prompted us to innovate. It was incredible in what it sort of stimulated, notwithstanding the great challenge that it visited upon us. And we had to think very creatively about how we were going to maintain that relationship we had with people. Clem and I were saying this just before we started. It was all uncharted territory, really, through COVID, and we were encouraged, stimulated to think about, well, what can we do? How can we maintain this relationship with our publics? And so the much vaunted digital pivot was something that we all went through at that time. Some of it was successful, some was slightly less successful. I remember watching a version of a program online that the National Museum of Australia did for children, and I thought, if there is any child that is bored enough to be watching this, I really want to not simply give them this program, I want to go round to their home and give them ice creams, because it was, with all due respect to my colleagues who did their very best in producing the show, that was a particular innovation that we might have done without. We tried things at least through that time. We all made mistakes. I'm focusing, for a cheap laugh on one of the failures. There were many successes through that time. And the most affecting thing was to see people say to us, thank you for making this effort. Some of the best examples, having told you about one of the worst, were things like this, fridge door fire stories. Jen Rodriguez, who's just joined you, is here and knows this intimately, probably knows it better than me, really. She should be up here talking about it. Fridge door fire stories was a Facebook site set up by the museum to really allow people to talk about those terrible bushfires that we experienced over the summer of 2019-20 that devastated a vast extent of the east coast bushland of Australia. Took 33 lives, sadly, and obliterated not just a lot of people's property, but also posed a great threat to the wildlife, the very distinctive wildlife of the east coast of Australia. People contributed the most heartfelt stories. I couldn't believe the sense of engagement that really resulted from us doing something as simple as creating a Facebook page to say, tell us your stories about your experiences in the bushfires. Similarly, when COVID broke, we started this Bridging the Distance, which was asking people to, really relate their experiences of lockdown. And again, the response was phenomenal. So much so that we realised we need to do a bit more on this, and colleagues of ours at the NMA really melded these ideas together in a co-creation site that was called Momentous. I'm just going to flash up just one story that the public contributed to Momentous, and I won't play the video that accompanies, which is the actual composition that this man made to commemorate the work of the Rural Fire Service volunteers in Australia in areas outside the cities. Firefighting is largely undertaken by volunteers who train. As it happens, because I live outside Canberra, I'm in one of those volunteer brigades. Heaven help us if I'm called to a serious fire. But we go through some training, and these people are donating their time to really save other people's life and property. 2 of these people lost their lives in a particular fire in this summer of bushfires. And this, if you can read it, it says, "They are heroes. I was inspired to write a song dedicated to 2 RFS volunteers who lost their lives. I shared the video and was contacted by their family requesting a copy of the song to be one day shown to their 18-month-old daughter." I hope this story touches your heart. It touches my heart yet again, despite the fact I know this story, so I'm just relating it to you. This was the power of that reach into people's homes, that those digital efforts allowed through the course of COVID and beyond. All that has happened in recent years, though, I think is a cautionary tale to us about the future of our museums and cultural institutions, and indeed the future of the cultural sector more generally. I still think for this, notwithstanding the fact we've made such great efforts to involve people in our work in the way that we're describing, and I know you're doing similar programs here, I still think we need to be doing more to meet the interests of our communities and deliver on the investments they make in what we do. That's effectively what they're doing. They're making investments in what we do. And I think if we want to see our museums, our cultural institutions thrive into the future, we must ensure that we work beyond the terms that we already are now. Now, to be explicit about this, unless we can show that we're ready to change and meet the challenges of this 4th industrial revolution, in which AI, digital media technologies, nanotechnologies and quantum computing will radically impact our societies, then I think our museums and other cultural institutions will wither. We have to show value, and we have to give our people good reasons to keep investing in these places. Now, the economic multiplier effects of major museums are pretty well documented these days. There's research here in Australia, around the world. We know that we contribute from this sector direct economic value to the communities in which we sit. But more than that, we catalyse broader creative economies. And Richard Florida's book, well known to you all, The Rise of the Creative Class, also talks about the way cultural amenities, including museums, are big attractors of human capital and innovation. It's great. There are some startling examples of this. We've seen the Bilbao effect reproduced around the world, where investments in cultural institutions, especially in areas that are up for regeneration or depressed areas, these investments can kickstart local creative economies. You know, within a decade of the Guggenheim opening there at Bilbao in 1997, there were 100 new galleries, design studios and creative businesses, catalysed by opening that museum. Tate Modern's 2000 opening in a converted power station on the South Bank also exemplifies how museums can help transform entire urban districts. The South Bank area now hosts Shakespeare's Globe, the National Theatre, BFI South Bank, and dozens of independent galleries. In my own country, There's a fantastic example for those of you who've been lucky enough to see it, for those that haven't, go if you can, in Hobart, Tasmania, our most southern state. Some unkindly say, you know, the island off Australia. Hobart is home to Mona, the Museum of Old New Heart, that was entirely funded out of private money. David Walsh really has spent his fortune in this audacious move establishing a museum that has fundamentally reshaped that city's trajectory. When Mona opened in 2011, it put Hobart on the map, very much so. It turned from being a quiet outpost, beloved of bushwalkers, touring the wilderness areas of the southwest of that state, into a vibey, cool city with a great arts and cultural life. The Bilbao effect rides again in our southernmost state in Australia. And here in Singapore, you've made enormous investments in the cultural sector with similar kinds of effects. These strategic investments have been very tied to your vision for cultural institutions as important facets of placemaking. Placemaking, the process by which communities transform meaningful, distinctive places with their own identity and sense of belonging. It relies fundamentally on cultural institutions like museums anchoring collective experience and shared memory. And your government has understood, it seems to me, that cultural institutions create what urban theorists call these third places, these gathering spots for our publics where people can come together, encounter each other, exchange ideas, etc. Now, while I think we acknowledge these wider values in museums, and governments have frequently invested in these institutions on the basis of their placemaking and economic value, I don't think we have fully internalised in our own practice the implications of this more expansive social role. What do I mean by this? Well, I suppose I'm saying that despite these turns, often we've largely gone on and done more or less in our day-to-day work what we've done before. So we know these arguments are being made. We know we're receiving significant capital investments because governments believe this. But actually, many of us go to work and largely do what we've always done in these places. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. We want those essential truths of the museum that it's found on these collections and its publics to continue. It's interesting though, for all the creativity and progressiveness that's often associated with cultural work that we're involved in, there's a part of our world that's just as conservative as any other. We often stay in our lanes in arts and cultural institutions, as in many other walks of life. We cleave to professional practice and our established networks as a way of anchoring our careers. But in truth, if you think about it, those audiences, our visitors, our publics, they don't really engage with the idea of culture in this siloed fashion attendant to our professional practice. They're frequently making connections between something they've read, a play that they saw at the theatre, and maybe an exhibition in a museum or a gallery. So, to that end, I would argue we need to expect our cultural institutions and those of us inside them to step beyond the tramlines of our conventional responsibilities. Now, I'm one of those people through the course of my career that's really insisted upon those professional practices. So I'm not wholly without some skin in this game, with some responsibility for the way this has been transacted. But I think it's time for us to transcend some of those conventional cultural divisions or genres of practice, think outside the square and establish new relationships and engagement with a host of other cultural agents, actors and practitioners in the wider community. And I suppose I'm suggesting, really, if I'm honest, that I want to extend the expectations that publics have of us to do that as well. Now, my own experience in COVID, leading the National Museum, brought me to this point, but also, I have to say, the experiences I had co-chairing the Australia-Singapore Arts Group with my great colleague and friend from here, Mrs. Rosa Daniel. And let me explain what I mean. One of the great strengths of ASAG, in my opinion, was that it brought together people working across a diversity of cultural domains and practices. There were collecting institutions, but also performing and visual arts, literature and design, and new media arts, all within the span of our interests. And of the many things that we did, one of the things I think that we really did very well was bringing together cultural leaders from these different domains together, both our countries, bring them together to discuss common interests, common capabilities, and also to develop work in common. And I came to know a great many people in the performing arts world, not just here in Singapore, but in my own country that I had never met before, all thanks to ASAG. And those experiences taught me to think about the conventions of our professional practice in museums and the need to think beyond the public turn to actually consider our relationship to other fields of cultural practice. Now, let's agree that we've never needed institutions like ours more than we do now, not as much for what they tell us, but more for what they might enable in our collective interest. Strengthening our public culture, demonstrating the value of dialogue, allowing for the respectful contest of ideas, investing in creative and cultural enterprise across the breadth and diversity of our communities. Again, I'm doing it. For me, that means understanding the museum's key role within something that I would call the wider cultural ecology of our societies. And we need to develop our work in terms of these interdependencies, not as an aside, but as fundamental to the work we're doing. And not just with other practitioners or even publics interested in the work of museums, but stepping outside our practice to work with people across the broader cultural domain. When I think of cultural ecology in this sense, I'm intentionally sort of broadening, or even you might say misusing, the term developed originally by an American anthropologist, Julian Stewart. Stewart coined the term cultural ecology as an attempt to get at the web of interactions between human beings and the natural world that exist at the heart of any society. But it was an anthropological term. It sought to understand the interplay of human societies and their environments. I'm using the phrase cultural ecology a bit looser and wider here, more expansive, I hope, to describe the mutual nature of relationships between institutions, agencies, organisations, practitioners, artists, creatives and publics in the cultural landscape of a community. And this more recent use of the term emphasises the complexity and systems framework of ecological thinking. Not so much its biological focus, and it really is trying to foreground the complex interrelationships within the social realm that produce culture and creative enterprise in the same way that we now think increasingly in the natural world about the complex interrelationships between species. We just don't think about the species, we actually think about the spaces in between. There's been growing use of this sort of ecological or environmental terminology to describe aspects. I'm the first one to do this, but I do think it's a powerful way of really focusing our attention on this broader network, this web of relations with other actors and participants and practitioners in the broad cultural field, rather than just thinking about our work itself. Now, I think there's a lot of advantages for us in thinking about museums in this way, within the wider cultural ecology and the responsibilities that come to them from being a key part of that wider cultural ecology. I think firstly, the term better acknowledges those interrelationships between production and consumption of art, for instance. Creativity, ideas and other cultural work is connected in this way between producers and consumers. It actually undermines this idea of a linear flow between production of art and consumption of art. And I think this is particularly useful in an era because of new technologies when we know that we've enabled a new expressiveness in the hands of everybody. Secondly, the term broadens our understanding of the cultural and creative actors or practitioners in their actions and motivations. It goes beyond this more instrumental idea of a cultural economy, right? And this sense of value that's narrowly described. And while there's nothing wrong with substantiating our case in some respects by an appeal to what we do for the economy, in a way we've shortchanged ourselves by not speaking to this broader web of relations that we're responsible for. And I also think it changes the nature of then the policy discussion that we're going to have about museums and cultural institutions as well. It asks us to think about museums more laterally, determined by the relationships with other players, not just acknowledging these relationships, but actually saying that is what constitutes a museum as much as anything else. And it's these interrelationships between the different points or nodes in the cultural sphere, I think, that are more important than the individual responsibilities we have for bits of the cultural pie. And I like the term because it feeds into that sense of placemaking that is so dear to the hearts of the community here as well, the arts and cultural community in Singapore. It allows us to talk about how we build nourishing human geographies, that we create places that give us something deep and important. And here, of course, there has been such an emphasis on placemaking. Now, the good thing about this as well, it implicates all of us, just in the way we live and breathe, not just the institutions and arts, it implicates all of us in the production of the cultural realm. And when we think like this, it really collapses a lot of the divisions that we see in the sector time and time again. And at this time, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by technology. I think people need to be reminded of their innate human value and the role they have in building place and community. And it's therefore an opportunity for museums, by engaging so broadly within the cultural sphere, to help people in that search for what it means to be human. Now, let me give you just a few suggestions of what this looks like. And unashamedly, I'm going to give you a couple of examples from the National Museum of Australia that were accomplished, particularly working with performing arts centres and practitioners. And these projects produced important creative work in their own right. They also helped to sustain performers in the music industry and the performing arts industry at a time when those sectors were under enormous pressure because they simply couldn't, there were no performance dates, they couldn't gig, they were literally without jobs overnight. So in 2020, the National Museum commissioned guitar virtuosi Slava and Lenny Gregorian to write a suite of music based on select items from Australia's National Historical Collection. I'm just going to play you one of these pieces, a little bit of it, now. problem that I have is one that I announced before. Every time I play that, I end up leaving it and I think to myself, really, I should have shut up and just played this tonight. This would have been fantastic. But this was an extraordinary project that is now led to a suite of music, about 70 minutes long, 18 pieces, that's been recorded, released through ABC Classic FM, a record label in Australia, played around the world at Albert Hall in London, and taking ideas about the collection in a completely different vehicle, not just across Australia in the performance of the Gregorian Brothers, but to other countries as well. Similarly, in 2021, the museum undertook an exhibition of video work that was produced by musicians, dancers and performance artists from 10 Asia Topa. Asia Topa is an Asian arts festival based in Melbourne each year. We made a series of grants to artists involved in the Asia Topa program to develop new work, which they then videoed as part of a development exercise for new work at this time when they couldn't perform, and then we used all those video pieces in an exhibition that was mounted at the museum. Again, thinking differently about how you use the spend of these cultural institutions to support and pump prime creative endeavour at a wholly different time, seeing some opportunity for a dividend within the museum itself, but largely being affected by the idea of enabling cultural practice in a completely different sphere. And this, again, was a project that helped to sustain a wider creative arts ecology at the precise time that it needed help. The biggest of these kind of projects was, and there's another image drawn from the Asia Topa program, the biggest of these projects, in at least in dollar terms, was a collaborative work with the renowned Australian musician and composer Genevieve Lacey just a few years ago. Genevieve worked with 60 other artists that are listed here. 60 people were able to secure work through this program to contribute to a monumental sound work breathing space that's now permanently installed in the Garden of Australian Dreams at the museum. I'm going to just ask the team to play that video as I just finished speaking about it. It features 6 distinct zones with different channels of this sonic program in each, and it changes every day for 365 days of the year, with seasonal change and with a change in the program of music on each of the days. No 2 days that follow each other is exactly the same as the last. And Genevieve will just come on and speak a little bit about it.
My name's Genevieve Lacey, and I'm a musician who works in all kinds of ways with sound. I trained as an instrumentalist, but nowadays I work more and more as a collaborator, a composer, and someone who creates large-scale projects that have music and listening at their core. So we're here at the National Museum of Australia, and downstairs is the Garden of Australian Dreams. I'd like to tell you about Breathing Space, a sound installation. It's a sonic rewilding. So we've divided the garden into 6 different spaces, and each area has its own composition. So there are particular sounds that tend to live within each of these spaces. So these trees behind you, it's a kind of a magical, softly shimmering world that lives in the trees. The main sound in the summertime is cicadas.
Again, you can get this online and listen to it. It's an incredible project. And she is a remarkable, remarkable musician as well. Turning to the situation here, it seems to me that much of this would resonate with you because in Singapore, there have been some great examples of the way that institutions are so embedded in the life of cultural experience that goes beyond the walls of your institutions. And I think about this when I think about things like the recently concluded Singapore Art Week, that involved the Asian Civilisations Museum, National Gallery of Singapore, the Singapore Art Museum, Esplanade, La Salle College of the Arts, on and on and on. So like a calling card for all your major cultural institutions involved in Art Week, bringing together these public institutions, private art and cultural interests in the city, and creating a dynamic program of arts and cultural experiences. I said that there were aspects of what you're doing that it seems to me are inspirational in the terms of what I'm saying tonight about driving a cultural ecology through the work of our institutions. Also notable is the continuing success of the Night Festival, which involves a host of key cultural institutions and assets. I was very lucky some years ago to be able to send one of the staff members of the National Museum of Australia to the National Museum of Singapore to take part in the program. She said she'd never worked harder, I have to tell you. It's a very nice thing for a director to hear. But it was a remarkable experience for her that she carried back to the National Museum. And indeed, the success of the Night Festival and the way the institutions have come together to support that work seems to me to be wholly consistent with this argument for seeing our institutions within, almost defined by their part in the wider cultural ecology, rather than somehow as adjunctive to their business. Your history, and to some extent your geography, mean, I think, that you've got a particular opportunity to show the benefits of this kind of thinking. It's open to you all to take this further and think dynamically about what a cultural ecology means, what your institutions can do to nurture and support it, and how you as museum workers can internalise that in the work that you do. Thinking, of course, about the mainstays of your professional practice, but also how you leap out of that. You exceed your professional practice to do this work with other agents, actors, practitioners in a much broader cultural realm. When you see your own practice as intimately tied to that of others who are all working together to explore and give a sense of life and vitality to what it means to be human, then I think you really start to come to a view about your work and its value in much deeper terms. It's this kind of thinking, I would argue, that can make certainly Singapore, with the natural advantages that it has in terms of its size, the capacity to bring people together very easily from across these institutions, you've got a particular opportunity to make this an emblem of your practice that the rest of the world can follow. In fact, my hope is that in what you do here, and indeed what we do in Australia, in different cities around my country, we start to explore the opportunities of this in ways that become distinctive for our institutions and which really lead the way for many institutions abroad. When I think about what it means to work in these places, I know that I feel nourished by the idea that I'm working not just in the interests of my institution and the publics that surround my institution, but I'm involved in the lives of performers, artists, writers of all kinds. That is when I think we truly understand the weight and cultural strength of these institutions that we love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Trinca. I would like to invite you to take a seat. And we're going to begin a dialogue and as well as a Q&A session. Now, I know it usually takes a while for people to warm up and ask questions, so I'll start first. I think this idea of cultural ecology is really something that can stimulate thinking in many different ways. And, usually when we talk about ecological systems, we tend to think about what indicators might, show up whether the ecosystem is thriving or not. For example, we might look at bees, for example. So if we're talking about cultural ecology, traditionally museums tend to look at visitor numbers and exhibition metrics. But if we're looking at it on a broader scale, in your opinion, what kind of indicators should we be looking at to think about?
It's a really good question. I think we all have felt some frustration with the endless pursuit of numbers that we can ink into the annual report to say, look how successful we are because this many people came. And I say that as someone who railed against it right up until the time that I became a director, and then I realised that I was going to be as preoccupied with numbers as any other director that's ever walked the earth. I don't know about Clem, he's probably better than me, but I found myself falling into the same pattern of behaviour. The truth is that it's a poor indicator of what I've been speaking about tonight. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be collecting numbers and metrics based on participation numbers of people. But if it holds that I think we need to go beyond even the extent to which we're engaged with publics, because what I'm saying tonight is something bigger than that. It's about saying, no, we need to think very actively about the relationships we've got to other players within the cultural sphere as well as publics who are there and active in that sphere as well. Then clearly numbers are not going to cut it. So that's the first point. I agree. It's not a good measure. That's a bit of a filibuster while I tried to think, well, what do I think is a good measure for this? And the truth is, I think it comes from a series of what are quite intangible values, really. It comes because we start to see the kinds of material effects of it in the cultures of the places in which we live. I'm as struck, and the only way I can think of how to get to that is that we have a series of qualitative measures and reports about the way that we've used these opportunities with other players to create new work. I think that's one way we can speak about this. And so it's interesting that when I tried to show you why this idea was worth something tonight, what I did was I went to the work and showed it to you. I showed you a couple of videos and cited some other work there. And I suspect that's going to be the strongest way that we have of convincing ultimately our publics, but our political masters as well, that this is a valuable way of thinking. You can describe how many people come to Night Festival, and you should. But really it's about what happened in the festival. What were the experiences that people were able to enjoy as a result of it, and the description of those, and people saying, oh yeah, that's true. You're right, I love that. And that seems to me to be the best way of evidencing that this way of thinking is transformative and can have positive effects.
Thank you. And then, just thinking about all the different projects that you've been working in, when we talk about ecology, you've brought up performers, musicians, and artists, but if you bring in the idea of placemaking, then we're also looking at other sort of stakeholders,
Absolutely.
businesses, maybe hotels and things like that.
Yeah.
So, in your experience, what has been sort of the most surprising or fruitful kind of partnership that has taken place?
Well, some of the most fruitful partnerships have been with other people who are not technically working in the cultural sphere, but whose business is in the way you described, with people doing, might be responsible for an F&B business. The relationship we had to the caterers at the National Museum was a special relationship in that way. And that we thought about their business as something that was very important to us. So through COVID, we effectively excused them from, paying rent at a time when they couldn't earn funds, because we wanted them to thrive, or to survive at least, so they could thrive after COVID. The important thing is the way they joined their business to the mission of the museum, and how responsive they were to the idea that they were doing something in their sphere, making of food itself an art. Let's be honest, I don't have to argue that case here in Singapore, where I think you all realise that. But they understood the power of what they were doing in the context of what we were making at the museum as an experience for publics. They did it there at the museum, but they were also engaged in work off-site that we were trying to support as well. And so one might have thought that was just going to be a transactional relationship with one's caterers, an external contract that we had to run the cafe and the rest of it. But I came to understand it was a much more nourishing relationship for what we were trying to achieve in the museum than I might ever have expected at the start of that process.
And now, if anyone has questions, I'd like to open it to the floor. If you raise your hand, we'll bring a mic to you. Yes, over there.
I don't work in the museum sector. I'm just curious, that's why I'm here. I think just now you brought up a couple of examples, like the Museum of New and Old, and I just
Art, yeah.
But it all, and like the Tate or the Bilbao, it's all very contemporary kind of art. So my question is, in developing this ecosystem, attracting the visitors, participatory work, right? Is it more geared towards is it more geared towards contemporary art museums then? How are other kind of museums going to achieve the same result? Or do you think it's replicable no matter what kind of museum you are?
It's a good question, and of course, I suppose it's worth me saying that the National Museum of Australia is not a contemporary art museum at all. It's a museum. I mean, it's not always easy to describe the National Museum of Australia, but let's say that it's a social history museum of Australian experience. So it's greater parts of its collections are First Nations collections, including artistic product of First Nations collections, but also collections that formerly you might have thought of as ethnographic, cultural objects that have come from those communities. And there's a lot of non-Indigenous material that is, the best way of describing it would be its historical artefacts, which through their association, everything from cars to furniture to jewellery, a whole range of material, and certainly you could talk about the museum itself and its very postmodern architecture that you saw up there as a kind of contemporary artefact in architectural terms. But largely, most of the collection is something you'd describe as a history museum collection. But I found this way of working to be immensely powerful for us. The idea that you're taking that piece of ochre that inspired that music by the Gregorians that you listened to, and you say that this is something that can render almost a new sense of emotion about the past, that's what I found very affecting by that. Now, I'm a historian by training. I want to explain what that ochre is in fairly sort of rational terms, a kind of a narrative exegesis about why that is an example of one of the oldest living continuous cultures on Earth, the First Nations community that gave life to that many thousands of years ago. But in a sense, one of the strongest ways of understanding that and that story of that age is actually emotional. It comes from listening to the music and having a kind of reverie or contemplative moment with it. And that's what I think is opened up by this as well, the kind of possibility of other ways of knowing very directly that we know is there when you come up in front of an object. We know it's not just a rational explanation about that object that gives you meaning. We kind of know that there's something visceral and intuitive about our reaction to a beautiful piece of ceramic, perhaps, such in one of the galleries here. But when you go the next step and you involve another artist in making with you a piece of work that's quite different, I think you're triggering the possibilities in another way for that reverie, that contemplative delight about the thing.
Hello, hi, I'm Chris. Prof, I'd like to ask you a question, and that is that it seems that when you talk about this ecology, right, this cultural ecology, it seems like it's like a shift, right? Before you thought of things in a certain way, and then you shift towards looking at it from a perspective of cultural ecology. I wanted to ask you from your experience as museum administrator, right? How did that shift operationalize in your museum? Like, what was the change? How did you like change the way you ran your museum? Did you change the resourcing, how you coordinated things, the processes? Just wanted to understand a bit more with that shift in perspective. Thanks.
So it's a great question, and the first thing to say is it's imperfect in my experience of it. I suppose if the truth is, if I'd stayed at the museum, I would have tried to prosecute it even more than I did, in truth. I hope it's actually done something in terms of imprinting itself on the life of the institution. Now you could ask Jen Rodriguez here as well. It's, of course, the museum itself is a particular kind of organism. And anyone that thinks I'm a bit nervous saying this in front of Clem because he's responsible for this now. I'm simply an ex-director. There's nothing so ex as an ex-director, you know. It's very freeing. You can say what you like in the way that you couldn't possibly before. But, you know, I think that all museums are kind of astonishing organisms to start with. Right? The notion that somehow you stand up the front as a director and you say, we shall do this, and it will be for this reason because I'm prosecuting an idea about a cultural ecology, that's never going to work, right? That's just not how it happens. Of course, there are times when a director makes a call, but there are a lot of times that what we're trying to do is engender an atmosphere or a condition or a culture in a place where this work takes place. I made a joke about the work that happened during COVID, hopefully at my expense, not the expense of our colleagues at the National Museum, because they were being encouraged by me to try anything at the time. So it is absolutely the case that some of it was never going to work, but the greater part of it did. It was incredible, some of the stuff that was produced. But you're doing things at such a rate that every now and again you're going to make missteps. It was okay to make the misstep. I like to think you make this change by allowing space and not crucifying people when something doesn't work and saying, hey, it's okay, let's move on, do another thing, right? Doesn't mean you keep doing the thing if it's not working, but, you know, you say, that's fine, let's go on from here. I think you also do it by licensing people to some degree. You try and create the circumstances when they see the value of it, and then you try and also make some choices about these kinds of projects with other players within the cultural sphere that are going to, in a sense, represent to your own people about a sense of possibility that they might not have thought of as well. It's not a perfect answer for you, and I think that it comes, if it occurred to me that this was the way that we should increasingly be working, it seemed to me that you could communicate that to others, and then you had to hope that they picked it up as well and started to run with it. And I think, you know, at times they did, however imperfect it was.
Any more questions from the floor?
Like in Singapore, you brought up the night festival, and I think I've only attended like a couple of times because I was overseas for the last decade. But how is there going to be sustained interest if this is just like, you know, a kind of like a few times a year? How do you continue? I mean, to even like create that thing with the artist, that costs quite a bit, right? And so basically, I think my question is, how do you keep it sustained?
Well, I think that's true of the life of these institutions more generally as well, even without some of this thinking. One of the great challenges in museums or in public cultural institutions is the extent of expectation you have for yourself about program, about how busy the program should be, how you keep creating energy in these places. Because really, and you can see in what I'm saying, I'm a person who believes in these places exhibiting a lot of energy. And in this particular case, exhibiting it by being connected to other key nodes, other key actors within that space. Inevitably, you can't have a $700,000 project that's being initiated every week. But this work's not done in a day either. So you're working on that project. That breathing space that went into the Garden of Australian Dreams, that paved area with the trees around it that you saw in the video, that was a work over 18 months and people actively engaged in it. 60 people outside the museum got work through it, right? Musicians, artists, performers. It takes time. But the critical thing, I think, is to continue to be making the relationships with people in this broader domain that may lead to some future work as well. And that when you are engaged with people in that way, let me give you a simple example, right? It's really easy when you're in a museum. I was a curator originally before I ended up going into management. It's really easy to do, and you have, your boss expects you to do that work that's in front of you. And I'm not suggesting that, as I said today, I'm so much of a radical that I'm saying you should just push that aside and just think about, you know, a cultural ecology and how you're going to nourish it by making relationships. But you can do that work and be open to the possibility that when you meet an actor, an artist, a visual artist, a musician, that you're actually searching for some commonalities. You're searching for the thing where your practice and their practice intersect. That's effectively what happened in the Australia-Singapore Arts Group when we were bringing these people together. And when you get the point of intersection, you think, I could work with this person. But if you never have that conversation where you're searching for, you know, what are you interested in? How do you think about that? These are really the essential ideas that animate cultural life. When you hit that point where you have common interest in something, that's where you know you've got an opportunity with those people, and you start to then work. Or maybe we could work together, maybe we could do something. What is it? You know, the thing with the Gregorians came when I was at a function related to the Australia-Singapore Arts Group in Adelaide, when one of the members on the Australian side of the committee, Douglas Gautier, who ran the Performing Arts Centre in Adelaide, asked the Gregorians to play at dinner. And I knew them, you know, I'd known of them as these key performers. And it struck me, I just thought, really, why wouldn't we have them at the museum? Why wouldn't we think about commissioning them, these great musicians, to make work that was related to the collection? And, you know, we started talking and they talked how much they loved Australian history. Off you go.
Any last questions?
You'll all be going to Wikipedia and looking up cultural ecology now, won't you? When you read about cultural ecology, you realise that there's a bit of a not quite torturing of the original intention of the term, which was a lot more about how to bring biology and geography together in anthropological terms. But there is now this growing use of it to describe this complex web of interdependencies, interrelationships in the cultural domain, which gets away from this idea that in cultural terms I would describe as speciation. You know, here is a museum responsible for this. Here is a performing arts centre responsible for this. Here is a library responsible for this. It's much more interesting to think about what are the spaces in between those institutions.
A great note to end tonight's conversations. And I really would like to thank Professor Mathew Trinca for such an enriching presentation. I think we also had a really wonderful dialogue going on here. We also like to thank Dalio Philanthropies for their generous support in making this talk and this entire series possible. Again, please join me in a round of applause for thanking Professor Mathew Trinca. Thank you, all of you, for coming down, and hope you have a wonderful evening.